Ukraine is destined to become a member of NATO. They deserve to be in NATO. No, I'm kidding. No, I haven't lost my mind if you were wondering where that's coming from. But I say it as sort of tongue in cheek and just kind of how funny, haha, it is to say. There are other people, though, really high ranking people in well paid positions that aren't laughing when they're saying that, though they probably should be. We're going to get into that later on, explain why I say that, and we're going to show you what they're saying. But we have somebody to really help guide us along today. Another one of your favorites, Jason Beardsley, Director of Vet Initiatives, who will Stand Together, and former Trump advisor, former combat Marine. Wait, was it Marine or was it Special Forces? Sorry, man. I didn't mean to just.
I was never tough enough for the Marines. I just went as a Green Beret,
Just a Green Beret. Didn't mean to disparage you there. My bad.
No, much props.
Combat, though, that's the issue there. You're the man there on the ground. Grateful to have you back, man.
Thanks for having me. What an incredibly insane time we live in. So it's great to have you on the air, and it's always good to be back with a great host like yourself, and to be able to call combat what it is and talk about the ground truth. So ready to go.
Yeah, well, you're going to get into that. So, of course, what's been in the news for weeks now is primarily here in the United States is the passage finally of this big so-called national security bill, which curiously had nothing to do with our national security, but we'll discuss that at another time, I guess. But it did have to do with help for Ukraine, and that was the biggest part of the package, a $61 billion package, which so many people had been claiming prior to the passage of that the only reason Ukraine is losing and starting to fall back is because the Congress has held it up. So now then they're going to be saying, okay, well, now here it comes. So things are going to be fine. Well, not so fast. There's already a case being built up as an excuse for why this package is not going to make a difference because it came too late. If only it had come last September when they first were talking about it, everything would be different. But that's one of the reasons I got Jason on board today, because, you can call a spade, and we're going to talk about what's real and what's not on the battlefield, and whether this aid made any difference or not, if it would have made a difference from September. But here's where we are right now. So let me put up this map because there's a couple of different areas that are really at stake right now where the Ukraine side is on definite retreat. Now, what you see on your map right here, if you'll notice in kind of the lower right-hand part, there's it's called Avdiivka. That's been in the news a lot lately. You may have heard that. That was a city that fell after a number of months of fighting. In February, I believe it was. Well, after Russia took some previous places like Bakhmut and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in 2022, I think, they kind of culminated after that, meaning that once they took the objective, they kind of stopped and rebuilt and refreshed or whatever, and it didn't go further. This time they didn't. As a matter of fact, they have not stopped at all. After taking Avdiivka, they've continued to move forward. So everywhere on this map you see, especially that the biggest green circle there in the upper left hand, basically, it's Ochertina. And then some number of other places. Everywhere you see the green circles and you see that yellow, that's where Russia continues to advance, and Ukraine is not being able to stop them. So that's one of the reasons why the supporters of this bill were so emphatic on getting it out there, was because they said Ukraine is losing, Russia is advancing, and we need that to stop them. So first question I want to ask you, Jason, now that you've had a little bit of time to look at this package and what's in it, is that package going to stop the bleeding in Avdiivka?
No. It's first and foremost, military aid and supply it takes a long time to get all the way to the front lines. There's challenges with that, and it gets dispersed on the front lines, and it's expensive, and incorporating it quickly is hard to do anyways. But that's not the real reason it won't make the difference. The real challenge here is one that you're pointing out from a military standpoint of combining the different forms of military weaponry. So artillery with armor, with air, with infantry, with intelligence. When those systems are all combined together and you have a unified effort, meaning every commander, every unit is sort of doing the same thing, you can mass and energize your forces for very particular strategic or tactical objectives, depending on what your gain is. That's the part that's missing here, is the Ukrainian army has survived Number one, by lodging an incredible defense, a lot of that infused by the United States and Western allies and support intelligence functions and things like that. But it's always easier to defend kind of in your home terrain than it is to offend. And so the offense is what we're talking about. How do you dislodge and push back the Russians? And forming an offense requires that unified effort, unified command, massing and energy and surprise and attack. So yes, will the weapons make some difference? Absolutely, because they're going through weapons at an incredible rate. But the question is, will it make a strategic difference in pushing back the lines? That's a much, much taller task.
Yeah, and you know, and one of the reasons why there's been this breakthrough in the Avdiivka area as opposed to some of the others, because Russia's been on the offensive, well, for all this year, actually starting before the end of last year, they started going on a general offensive, a kind of a creeping offensive all along the 600-mile front. And much of that they have been fighting through, to include in this area here originally, were fortifications, many of which were built back in the from 2014 forward. So stuff that the Ukraine side had really spent a lot of time tying in together and having mutually reinforcing positions and all that sort of thing. But now that in this area, Russia has broken through that line. So they're now into area where the Ukraine side has never had defensive positions. And it's really showing, because now then we've actually seen more and more video of larger tank formations from the Russian side, in still relatively small number, but in platoon and it looks like company minus strength, where they're able to drive through without any minefields because the Ukraine side is running low on mines. That's also something not in this package, but maybe even more important than artillery shells, something that will slow the Russians down. They have figured out how to get through the mines, and now then they're leaping forward, not just in 200 or 300 meters a day, but in a couple of times 1 and 2 kilometers per day in some of these areas there. And now then they're getting into areas where Ukraine's having a much more difficult time stopping Russia because they just don't have the fortifications. And so the question is going to be, how much further can Russia exploit this? And do they have the operational reserves necessary to, if they punch through this all the way, to be able to push through? I don't know if you have any visibility on that, but that certainly is a big factor.
Well, their challenge is also numerous once they penetrate the lines. Right now, we're seeing a skirmish along a sort of defendable line that's going to move a little bit this way or that way, depending on where the forces are. But to truly do, again, let's call it a run to Kyiv, which was the opening days of this campaign back in 2022 February timeframe, that is such a large challenge. Remember, they rolled in with, I want to say it was 800,000 soldiers and service members. Well, that's not enough to do the work. This is a very large country. It's about the size of Texas, and you really would have to mass in order to move that line significantly and permanently hold it. So what you're seeing on the lines right now, and that's a sort of divides the Luhansk and Donetsk province from sort of the western part of Ukraine, are opportunities to strike and penetrate and also take key terrain, which are like cities and logistics hubs, so they can continue to cut off or disrupt the supplies to the Ukrainian front line. That's part of the reason they want to hold certain lines of communication or roads or loggerheads, because what they're hoping to do is disrupt any supply routes coming in for the Ukrainians, while at the same time managing to keep open their supply routes. And remember, what's on the backside of this for Russia is they're backed up against their country. In other words, their backside or their rear echelon is Russia. So they can manufacture and roll in through the Luhansk and Donetsk province. They've got Crimea now locked down, the land bridge there, and even to the north they have place. So the real challenge is they probably couldn't make a full-blown attack. I think everybody perceives that they would do that easily. But again, that takes a large army. It's not it's a challenge. They failed at that the first time. I think Vladimir Putin at this point is using his forces to move the needle on what's going to be the eventual negotiated settlement here. What makes it tricky is the more that the United States fuels this fight, the longer we put that off.
Yeah, and to your point there, that one of the other cities you may have heard in the news is a place called Chessar, and that's where Russia is also moving. If you can throw that map up there, because what you see in here, Russia, actually the lines are a little bit further. The red line is a little bit further than what's depicted on this map right here. But Chessar is a really important place precisely for the reason you mentioned, because it has lots of north and south lateral lines of communication that Ukraine uses to move troops and ammunition and other weapons throughout that section of the front. If Russia is able to take that one, it will be a huge problem, because now then they'll have to go much further, and it'll be more difficult for them to keep the other parts of their front manned and supplied, which will then put more pressure on from the Russians. So we're going to see how all that plays out. I think I agree with you that that Russia is not likely to make any big aero movements. I'm not sure that that's in their interest right now, or that's what they're trying to do. But they are definitely pushing along and breaking through where they can, and they're going to try to keep the methodical pressure on. And over time, that can have a decisive impact at the strategic level.
Yes.
So if we're talking about what's real on the battlefield, so actually, let me put a pause there. From your perspective, given where things are now, where they've been, and where things are going right now, especially with the huge problem with mobilization the Ukraine side has, and with the large influx of personnel that the Russian side is able to recruit, not even for forced mobilization, and their industrial capacity, where is this war? Where can this war go?
I think a lot of people miss one of the greatest weapons you can have in war is time. Time. If time is on your side, which it is in the case of Russia, you can just wait your enemy out. And this has been a classic Russian strategic stance for a long time, right? We throw troops at it, we can exhaust them forever. We don't care about our people, and we can grind them to the nth degree. Whereas Ukraine doesn't have that kind of time, and they're losing generations of young men and trying to press them into service. So that's a point you've been really good at, which is talking about the manpower, the resources. How many men do we need to fill this army? Well, they don't have it. So Russia can just hang out, do these minor attacks, skirmishes along the line, and continue to keep this fight going for 10 years, 20 years. They could do that as long as they wanted. That's the problem here, is with that in mind, they know that they're in a position where there's no critical thing that they need to do at this stage. They've got the land bridge, and they've got all their forces with capability to resupply and manufacture, and the Ukrainians don't have that. So notice what the Ukrainians are telling us. Every day, it depends on the West. It depends on Iowa congressmen. It depends on taxpayers out of Wisconsin. Like, we are actually supporting this war. And what they're saying is, if we don't do it, we're going to end up fighting the Russians somewhere else. But that's a ploy. And at the same time, we are expending our depleted resources down to really dangerous parts. If you look across the Navy, the Army, we got recruiting challenges. So the answer is, where this leaves us and where this began is, Russia always had the advantage of land. Number one, this country is on their doorstep. That's like having the United States being able to fund a war or fuel a war in Mexico. We can go there all day long, right? This is on Russia's front door. And number two, they have time. They can material this thing from all sorts of different ways, whether it's their economy or going to North Korea or going to China. So there's a lot at stake here. And I understand the West's position. They feel like a strategic win to wear down Russia is a good idea, but it's a gamble. And it also risks escalation, because Russia knows at the end of the day, we hold nuclear warheads. We have tactical warheads. I don't think they're going to use them, but they certainly are going to use that threat. And that's always on the table for them. So they have time. They have a trump card up their sleeve. They have the ability to wear us down. And the only thing we have at the end of the day is a bunch of feel-good platitudes.
Yeah. And, I think one of the key things you said there, Jason, was that Russia could go another 5-10 years, no problem. They have the resources, the capacity, and I think the national will to do that. The other side, we don't have 10 years to do this. And we're going to, that number is important, because you're going to hear it pop up here and again in just a second. But one thing I want to point out, too, that's it's given some people optimism on the Ukraine side, is because, this U.S. aid package was just passed, but it wasn't the only one. And our friend over at History Legends, Alex, had a show a couple of days ago where he talked about what some of the Europeans are doing. Check this out.
While they wait for reinforcements from the latest mobilization law, as well as lethal aid and ammunition deliveries from their US and European partners. A coalition of European countries aim for the first deliveries of 24 F-16s to start this summer, out of a total of 97 meant for Ukraine. Spain is about to send an additional 19 Leopard 2A4s to Ukraine. Sweden and Denmark have announced the joint production of 35 new CV90 midlife update infantry fighting vehicles, also meant for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Bulgaria will transfer 100 BTR-60PB they had in storage. The US pledged 250 M1117 Guardian armored security vehicles, equipped with a 40mm Mark 19 grenade launcher and a 50 caliber heavy machine gun. And the Christmas list goes on, with France promising to send hundreds of its VAB armored personnel carriers to Ukraine, as well as a total of 78 Caesar howitzers.
So that's when you combine all that together, that's actually a lot of stuff. It's a relatively small number of howitzers, but a large number of armored personnel carriers of various types. But what's curious is what's not there. Nobody said anything about tanks, and only a handful of F-16s, and there's a lot of shortcomings with that too. Is that package, in other words, is a lot of armored personnel carriers, is that what Ukraine has been missing? And will that change the dynamics on the defensive battlefield?
It's a fantastic question. I think you roll that tape, you hear that Christmas list. It looks great, sounds reasonable. But again, we're men who have fought on the ground with an endless chain of supply. We were not lacking F-16s. We were not lacking tanks or MRAPs or whatever other, high-speed modern weaponry you can imagine. But those aren't what necessarily turns the fight. And what you've talked about, again, the big gap is manning, and training. The resources exist in the people who drive those tanks, fly those planes, and the leadership that has coalesced a plan of action that looks something like, hey, the units are working together to achieve an objective. I mean, the greatest example you can look at perhaps is Normandy and D-Day, right? These are all synchronized efforts to do a very particular thing, which is to encourage the land in Europe and to move the beachhead further down and penetrate the German lines. That's the kind of thinking that it takes. But to do that, you have to build your command structure in such a way that you can mobilize every one of those pieces we just got through seeing in an effort that is synchronized against your national strategy. So what is the national strategy? This is something that we've been missing from the beginning, and the administration is pressed for it. We're listening for it, but we don't really know because the Ukrainian armed forces do not have a history of long conventional warfare that establishes a non-commissioned officer corps that executes orders coming down from an officer corps that are all concerted back in a Pentagon or a headquarters. And right now they've been relying on the U.S. to sort of imitate or fake that stuff. We had a CIA
Right.
in there. We're giving them intelligence that's coming from places like Poland and big fusion centers. And we got a lot of people that lost our two wars advising the Ukrainians how to win their war.
Yes.
I mean, you can fake the funk a little, but notice that we don't have generals in our ranks that have won wars.
Yeah, that's a really sobering thought right there. We've actually had former NATO Colonel Jacques Beau on our show, who kind of packaged that whole thing together you just talked about there, in that we have the NATO and U.S. side is a system of systems that's all well resourced, trained, and educated all the way up the ranks, and none of that exists here. And you can throw a bunch of pieces, hundreds of armored vehicles in that package you talked about, many hundreds, but without a system and without trained personnel, it's just noise on the battlefield. It's not something that it's not going to change anything. And that in the defense is not what they're needing. They're not needing more armored vehicles in the defense. That's more something for an offense or whatever. So this is not really providing what they need right now anyway.
The analogy is something like, a high school band that we just donate, hundreds of thousands of dollars of fantastic instruments and, Stradivarius violins and pianos, and hand them off to a bunch of high school kids who haven't yet learned to play symphonic orchestral music.
Well, that's a good example.
You're going to get all these incredible things, but if you don't have the infrastructure and know which sections are doing what at what piece of the movement, well, then you're just going to get a little bit of noise. So,
Yeah,
a
lot of noise.
You've been creative.
Okay, so that's kind of the tactical situation. That's kind of lay it out there. So there's, as I view it, and as my assessment is, that there is no rational path that Ukraine will ever win the war under any circumstances, no matter how much stuff is given, how many years they have of anything anyway, because the manpower thing, you can't replicate that. You can provide more weapons when they get destroyed. You can't provide more men unless you want to get NATO involved on the ground, and then we have a whole different process. But in terms of what's the Ukraine side, you can't replace the hundreds of thousands that they've already lost. And so, like you said a while ago, they can never match what the Russians can do over 10 years. That's not, however, stopping our senior leaders from claiming otherwise. So now here, first of all, and you're going to hear a series of statements here by some of the senior leaders, both in Ukraine, United States, and in NATO itself, talk about where they're going and how, NATO membership is something that's going to happen here. But you also see, I think, that there's the beginning of a narrative of what they're going to do, because I cannot imagine any scenario where everyone I'm about to put on screen here knows everything you just said, knows what the balance genuinely is, but they want to set the stage to avoid blame. So here's the first one. I want you to, I'll just see if you catch it. What roll this first tape?
NATO allies have not delivered what they promised. The United States spent months not agreeing a package for Ukraine, and European allies have not delivered the amount of ammunition they promised. And this has had serious consequences on the battlefield. The lack of ammunition has enabled the Russians to push forward along the front line. Lack of air defense has made it possible for more Russian missiles to hit their targets. And the lack of deep strike capabilities has made it possible for the Russians to concentrate more forces. And we see the consequences of that now.
Damn it, if only y'all had given it to us last September, none of this would happen. So you see, they're already saying, because you delayed, it's tough now.
This is laying it right on the American taxpayer. We just came out of our tax season. We're going into an election. And what the elite globalists are telling you, it's your fault. It's all your fault. You had to give more money. You had to do it earlier. And you didn't even give these guys deep strike capability. By the way, just so that doesn't get missed, what that means is Jens Stoltenberg just stand there at the NATO head and says, we wanted Ukraine to have the ability to strike inside the country of Russia. All right, so we're aggressing now. We want to be the aggressors and fund this war. All they're doing is guaranteeing themselves another 10 years of funding this campaign, and they're making sure that there will be hostilities between us and Russia. This is about a bigger plan that looks like they would love to, if given the right circumstances, collapse a superpower and take over their energy routes, take over their revenue streams. Because remember, all of Europe sort of buys their energy in large parts from Russia. And
still, actually, by the way, not many people realize that. That's still going on today.
Right. So we want to get LNG in there. We'd love to be the suppliers, take out the Russian revenues, take a player off the board. It's a strategic kind of foreign policy thinking that's kind of old world style, become the Northern Hemisphere hegemony, the sort of imperialism, and be able to compete against China, the Southern Hemisphere hegemony. So this is a little bit of, smart guys thinking around the chessboard that, if we make all the right chess moves, we'll be in charge of the world and we get to tell people. But at the end of this, they're using the Ukrainian men and women as their leverage to keep this war going. Now, I mean, for my money, Ozzy Osbourne already told us this story, Black Sabbath, right? This is a bunch of war pigs, like black witches at the masses, learning how to sacrifice troops for the evil minds that plot destruction. I mean, you can go back. It's all over this. We make money, and you can hear that from our diplomats, that they're excited that our businesses, Raytheon, General Dynamics, are doing well. Meanwhile, we're losing generations of Ukrainians, but they don't care because Wall Street's loving this. And so do the politicians. It's in their districts. So there's a lot of good reasons, from their perspective, that they want to continue this. And what you just heard is we want to guarantee the hostilities into the future because we want Ukraine to think of themselves as NATO. Now, that puts the burden on Zelensky and any other leader there to say, hold on, maybe NATO is not the right thing for us. Now, if anybody says that, now you've become a traitor to the West. But think about it. Again, this is like Cuba Missile Crisis. When the Russians were putting missiles in Cuba, we didn't like that so much. Yeah. But when you flip the tables around and we're putting missiles in Ukraine, we just think, well, that makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, because we don't flip the tables around. We never think about that. But that's not all Stoltenberg said. Earlier today, just hours ago, actually, he spoke before the Ukrainian Rada, their parliament, and he said some of these same things, but he took it a little bit further. Check this out.
NATO allies have provided unprecedented support to Ukraine over the past 2 years. 99% of all military aid. But in recent months, NATO allies did not provide the support we promised. For months, the United States was unable to agree a package of support, and European allies delivered far less ammunition than we said we would. These delays have had consequences, and you know that better than anyone else. Ukraine has been outgunned, so Russia has pushed forward on the front lines. Ukraine has lacked air defense, so more Russian missiles and drones have hit their targets. Ukraine has lacked deep precision strike, so Russia has been able to concentrate more forces. But it's not too late for Ukraine to prevail.
That was just a bizarre, in a very concise time. He first of all says that NATO has given unprecedented support, and truly it has been. Thousands upon thousands of military vehicles, millions of rounds of artillery shells, hundreds of millions of various types of other armament, intelligence support, training, targeting support. I mean, unbelievable stuff. But the problem was a 6-month gap in one country sending their stuff here. Now it's all possible, and then wraps it up by saying they can still prevail. That is bizarre.
I mean, Americans need to be extremely upset about this because they're being labeled as the ones who are causing the loss for the Ukrainians. Like, Ukraine stood up and said, we want to punch Russia in the face. And all of a sudden we're dragged into this fight like it's our role. Now, meanwhile, veterans are standing in line waiting 60 days, 90 days to get help from veterans health care. We have an open border crisis. There's crime within our cities. We have poverty that's racked. We have homelessness. We have problems that we can actually pay attention to and get bread and food on the tables of Americans right now. But instead, we're all overseas, all in on wars of, let's call it proxy wars of potential foreign policy influence intermingling in the international realm. We're playing the Great Game 2.0, right? It's an updated version of the old Great Game that we just lost and handed back to the Taliban Afghanistan while giving Iraq over to the Shia that are run out of Iran's Tehran Mullah group, right? So on all these fronts, the American taxpayer ought to be extremely upset. Right now, this is the season and the cycle for them to weigh in at the voter polls. So you saw your Speaker of the House, who agreed in kind at first, walk into a SCIF meeting, that's a secure confidential facility, get some kind of briefing that scared the living daylight out of him, and he walks out and does a 180 on 3 of his positions. And next thing you know, taxpayers are told, good, you did a great job. You're on the hook for $95 billion. So we're supposed to feel good about our defense. And I joked about this with someone else. All the reasons why they're saying this was great for our defense makes me think, well, we ought to just give our $800 billion instead of giving it to the DOD. We ought to just fork it over to foreign countries, because it sounds like that's the way we have our national defense. This is a ridiculous story. And if Americans don't start holding these politicians accountable, all you're going to see is more of this. You heard it. Jens Stoltenberg is telling us we want Ukraine as part of NATO. That is going to make Russia hostile to NATO for a long time coming. Yeah. So that's them trying to underwrite. This is like a business, right? How can I get revenue over the next 10 years? How can I stabilize that revenue? Well, if we can piss off Russia enough, we'll have
a market.
It's crazy.
You got to have a market. So in kind of the version you're talking about here, it seems like Zelensky is ready to play his role, because he went out and said that his country deserves to be in NATO.
We are also preparing for the NATO summit to be held this summer. A strong political signal is needed. The alliance should not be afraid of its own strength or shy away from its own foundations. Every country that shares common values and is willing to actually defend them deserves an invitation to join the alliance.
Deserve an invitation. I wonder where he got that idea. Oh, maybe from our Secretary of State, who said this.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. We will see, I think, in the summit, very strong support for Ukraine going forward and its relationship with NATO.
So one more time, Jason, in this bizarro world,
Yeah.
knowing that the NATO charter specifically lays out the criteria for inviting new countries. One is that they have to have all internal disputes resolved. There's this thing been going on since 2013 between the east and the west of the country, not quite resolved. So we'll just put a little asterisk on that one. And then the other one is you have to have all border issues resolved. So you have no issues with any potential external borders. I mean, it makes sense. You don't want to bring in somebody who's going to have a civil war or who's got, like, say, enmity with their border, and they could draw everybody into a war. That would be worsening everyone's security, not improving it. So that's our rule. Why then do I hear Jen Stoltenberg adding one more time this?
Well, I really believe that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, and therefore I'm working hard to ensure that Ukraine will become a member of this alliance. To have that decision, we need all allies to agree. We need consensus. We need not a majority, but actually 32 allies to agree. I don't expect that we will have that agreement by the summit in July, but I really hope that we can demonstrate that we are moving Ukraine closer to membership.
Make this make sense to me. What the charter says and what they're doing, make it make sense to me.
I mean, you point out some brilliant things that nobody talks about is the charter, right? What is NATO supposed to do and how do they include members? So what you're not hearing from the rest of the punditry or the political class is that before you become a member, solve your problems and don't be at war with yourself or some sort of border dispute. Those are phenomenal pieces that would actually halt this in its steps. But notice how we're not getting treated that way. So the public is treated to the bigger patina, the pablum, the utopian vision. Let's just have them in NATO. Let's just bring them in NATO. That's going to solve all our problems. And then Ukraine will beat Russia and everybody will go home happy. But this is meant to cover up what is missing, which is, number one, losses on the ground are very tragic and generations are being killed right now. What it's also covering up is inside Ukraine, there's a lot of corruption. There is not agreement on how this rolls out. And there is a very difficult time right now impressing or drafting or conscripting enough bodies to fight this war for the next X years, 5, 10, however long it goes. On top of that, the idea that they should be in NATO or deserve to be in NATO because they want to be in NATO would beg the question, why isn't everybody in NATO? Why doesn't everybody join NATO? And the answer is because the alliance was built to have very specific interests that were post-World War II, and they were a sort of a hedge work against the incursion of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. Well, notice that's gone now. I don't know if anybody noticed, but we won. And theoretically, what that allowed these nations to do is step back from a war footing and become more of a trade partners. This is what Russia's been doing with Europe for the last 30 years. And again, you and I pointed out all the energy supplies, the back and forth trading. There's trillions of dollars of capital investment.
Yeah. Now, I want to go back to something you said earlier, and you said that Russia has the wherewithal. They have the natural resources. They have the human resources. They can go on another 10 years if they need to, because they don't have to win right now. They just have to be making methodical progress. But the other side doesn't have that same 10 years. But as you said, I'm not sure they got another year left in them personnel-wise. Then we can talk about all the other categories. But that's not stopping Brother Zelensky from saying that's exactly his target. Check this out.
Our teams, Ukraine and the United States, are currently working on a bilateral security agreement, and we are already working on a specific text. We are discussing the specific foundations of our security and cooperation. We are also working on fixing specific levels of support for this year and for the next 10 years, including armed support, financial, political, and joint arms production. The agreement should be truly exemplary and reflect the strength of American leadership.
And Jason, you know who, besides all the arms makers, you know who else loves 10 more years of war? I got to put this in there. Brother David Petraeus. Roll the clip.
Oh.
I was not one who believed that you had to actually end endless wars. In fact, I opposed the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yes, it was frustrating. Yes, it was maddening. Yes, our partners in Kabul were not all that we might hope they would be. We only had 3,500 troops on the ground. We hadn't lost a soldier in a year and a half. There was no reason. We had $25 billion and an $850 billion defense budget. So we need to be careful about this. This one, we need to ensure that Ukraine prevails when this is over.
Yeah. So your reaction was the same as mine when I first saw that. I said, "Oh my God!" He said it out loud. I didn't want to get rid of the forever wars. I wanted them to keep going. So, yay! Here's another 10-year one that they want to keep.
I mean, I want to give these guys credit. They're open about their desires. They're very honest about it. They're reading the wrong part of the Roman history, where Rome is chasing Carthage for decades on end because they love foreign wars, and they're bleeding out the empire while citizens are a wreck. And then, of course, they come up with their famous bread and circuses. They got the wrong part of the Roman history, and they're trying to apply it to American history. What if we had endless wars? And what if we extended our lines of military offense all over the world so that we could have a hegemony that rules the seas and so on and so forth? And Britain tried this, France tried this, other countries have tried this, China's in the process of doing it itself. But what's missing in these conversations is the Constitution, the citizens, the Americans that are supposed to be voting for the wars. These endless wars that David Petraeus wants are supposed to be voted on by the congressional body and given a sort of a draft for the executive to execute. And they were never supposed to be endless. This is what our founders were worried about. It's what Eisenhower was worried about. It's what Kennedy was worried about. I mean, any decent legislator, lawmaker, ought to be worried about a comment like that. And again, I'll give them credit for being honest. You hear everybody saying it. They want NATO to be bigger, larger, more expansive, and they want wars going on for a long time. And you're going to have to guess why they want that. But the point is, if you're asking them, they're going to tell you it's because it makes the world safer, smarter, better for trade, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, wars are supposed to be fought if you absolutely have to, and like there's no other alternative for your national security. Not because we want Kabul to stay in power or Baghdad to stay in power or the Syrian Democratic Forces in another country outside of their country to stay in power, or Kiev to just keep fighting on forever. It's supposed to be to end the wars as quickly as possible for our safety and security and economic prosperity. Those things aren't even being considered.
This is an Orwellian trick. Orwellian meaning the language. These aren't wars. Now, Ukraine and Russia proper, that's a war. But the things we've been involved with are their insurgencies, their insurrections, their long-term proxy wars. They're sort of this right below the threshold of all-out war. We have done limited wars. And by the way, this has been exciting for the people behind them because you're not getting the body count you got in Vietnam, right? That's what shut down the Vietnam War was the body count. It went up. It was up on the news every day. And people are like, yeah, I'm not sure we're into this. So now you reduce the body count. You notice we lost 1/10 of what we lost in Vietnam, and between Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years, they got away with real low body counts so they could extend the wars. You just heard David Petraeus tell you that's the way to do it. And now we don't even have a body count because we got someone else to do our fighting. So the politicians sit back and go, hey, congratulations, my Wall Street portfolio is doing great. Defense contracting is doing amazing. I just bought another house in, Bahamas or something. But the Ukrainians, meanwhile, they want to fight. So let's give them all the weapons and keep them at war with Russia. Russia's neighbor. This is Russia, right? Prokofiev, this great Russian composer, is Ukrainian. Half of the Russians have come from or share a culture or commonality with Ukraine. So now that you have this cultural sort of commonality, you're now threatening the Russian cultural sort of communal ties on their near periphery with a NATO presence, a Western presence that you just heard is meant to inspire years of war or limited war, whatever they want to call it. This is why Americans ought to be upset. We've got our own problems here. We've got our own borders. Let's get that straight.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that stands alone on its own merit. And I still have some aggravation from whether the Senate or the House version of these bills that expressly didn't talk about the border, even though every American, or not every American, but a majority of Americans has that their number one issue for voting in the next time. No one's even doing anything about it, much less talking anything. But I'm sorry, I digress. Let's stick with what we got here. This issue here, there's another part of this equation that none of these people are talking about here. And I want to ask you a question on the strategic level and the likely outcome, the likely tactical outcome is that Ukraine will eventually run out of men and they'll just collapse out of sheer exhaustion. They just won't be able to keep going. I could also argue that this package that we just passed, it could well be the last one. They're talking about 10 years. I assure you, no American is going to be cool with continuing to lay this money out every year for 10 years. They're not going to do it. So the likelihood is it's going down. Here's the question. In the event that it plays out the way it's likely to, what is going to be the security arrangement when you have a victorious Vladimir Putin, despite all of our efforts, despite NATO pulling out the stops to try and break him economically and militarily, and it didn't work. Their economy got stronger, and then eventually their military may succeed on the battlefield. What is that going to do to the balance of power?
Well, it's unfortunate for Ukraine. This is going to end, like you're suggesting, sort of at the Dnieper River, maybe a little bit west of that, but more than likely the river's going to form the boundary, putting those 2 or 3 or 4 eastern provinces in the, let's call it the proxy squarely of Russia. Then at the negotiating table, what you just heard Zelensky say is we want bilateral security agreements. For Americans that are tracking, a bilateral security agreement is like a contract. We will cooperate on these following pieces. And if somebody breaches that contract, we're obligated to X, Y, and Z. So we want to, what he's saying is he wants us to be obligated to the defense of Ukraine. Yep. Should the Russians continue some sort of provocation in the future after the settlement. What that would do is make the negotiated settlement extremely difficult on Ukraine. And if Ukraine doesn't get smart, Turkey smart, Erdogan smart, and understand how to play both the U.S. and Russia, they're not going to survive. And what I mean by play both U.S. and Russia is they have to be a friend to both and an enemy to both. They have to understand how to navigate defense contracts, weapon systems. And if they're sitting on Russia's doorstep and all they do is utilize the West or try to facilitate Western military expansion, they're always going to be a provocation to the Russian defense cooperation. So the Russians are going to be looking for someone who can come in and smartly split the baby, right? And again, look at Turkey. Turkey's got S-400s. Those are Russian systems. They're a NATO ally. And notice nobody's messing with Erdogan. It's because he stood up for his equities, not the United States equities and not Russia equities. And I don't always agree. I mean, they're an agitator. They told us no when we invaded Iraq. If you remember, the overflight of their country was shut down and rejected. Turkey said no. But the point is, Turkey has survived in a very difficult region playing, let's call it internecine politics, playing one player off the other and managing that. And if Ukraine fails to catch the model and they become, let's call it a proxy to the West, we're going to be locked in burning up Ukrainian resources and bodies for a long time.
Until they run out of bodies. And then this whole game falls apart. So whatever these people actually want, I don't think they're going to get it. But we'll have to leave it there, actually, because we have another show coming up this afternoon that a lot of people are going to want to watch. But I'm so grateful for having you on today to really putting some clarity behind this and to exposing what's really going on under the scenes. Thanks so much for coming on.
Always tough. What are you talking about on your next show?
Man, it's got me hot already. I'm really ready to get on it. At the congressional hearing this afternoon, Representative Matt Gaetz and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin got into this back and forth over this pier that we're building in Gaza. And, well, I'll just say that the Secretary of Defense was unusually honest and candid about something that basically makes the American people, it treats them like they're stupid. And like he just didn't have any shame in admitting he thinks you're stupid and they can do whatever they want to do. Tune in about 20 minutes or about 15 minutes now, 3 p.m. Eastern time to find out what we're talking about. Thanks. And we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.